Edward Jones explores the dynamics of former slaves owning other slaves in antebellum Virginia. I discuss this and more on today's episode. To Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today it is, it's nothing specific, but I do want to talk about a book that I read for Black History Month. It's a book that is about slavery. I am referring to The Known World by Edward P. Jones, which was published in 2003. For those who don't know, Edward Jones is a Black American writer who has been getting his work published since the 1990s. He primarily writes about slavery and the Black experience in the world, and he's won a number of awards for his work. I really enjoyed this. I had a few problems with it, but I thought it was a pretty solid read, and I do hope to find more of Edward Jones's work in the future. Be on the lookout for that. But yeah, without further ado, let's talk about The Known World. I'll do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we'll move on from there. So The Known World focuses on a couple different characters, but its primary focus is exploring the life of and the death and what comes after his death of Henry Townsend. He is a former slave who in Virginia who earns his freedom, stays in Virginia even though it's a slave state, and starts a plantation and begins buying slaves. At the beginning of the story, we learn about his passing, and we see the character of Moses, who wants to be like Henry and has probably been with Henry the longest, but he's trying to figure out how he can sort of get out of his slave life. We learn a little bit more about Henry's history, including being a slave on the Robbins plantation, earning his freedom, and working under the tutelage of Robbins in an effort to learn how to become a good, slave master and have your own plantation and things like that. He eventually marries a woman named Caledonia, and I think she was a former slave as well, and they try to have a life together. We learn about John Skiffington, a man who is a sheriff. I think they have a slave named Minerva or a daughter who is mixed race, and she eventually leaves for Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, that area, DC or something like that. But John and his wife stay in the Virginia area, and although they don't like slavery, John is the sheriff, so he's kind of enforcing the law about slavery, which is all kinds of strange, but also shows some hypocrisies and various things like that. Later, Henry earns his freedom, which allows him to be with his parents, Augustus and Mildred, and then he starts buying slaves under the influence of Robbins. We also see that there's punishment for slaves in the story. A character named Elias tries to run away and gets brought back, and the slaveholders end up relying on the services of a Cherokee bounty hunter named Odin, who cuts off parts of ears and is willing to do it again if Elias tries to run away again. And then Robbins later sees Henry and Moses kind of playing around, roughhousing in front of the home that Henry is building, and Robbins tells him to knock it off, that he's supposed to be Moses' master, and how would other people look upon Henry if they were to see something like this? Robbins wouldn't be able to protect him about everything. And later when Henry goes and talks to his parents, they find out that he has purchased a slave, and they're just like, what's wrong with you? You could have freed Moses, but you chose to enslave him instead. I thought we taught you better. And that creates a rift between them as well. And then after Henry dies, Caledonia takes over, and she has a much softer touch, but people believe that the plantation is going to fall apart under her leadership. We learn about Travis, the patroller, who is a bit of a sadistic individual, doesn't like slaves at all. Skiffington has a problem with him, but never outright just like punishes him for any of his actions. And one of the things that Travis does is he kidnaps Augustus, even though Augustus is free, and sells him into slavery again. And Augustus travels down the East Coast with the people who are trying to sell him. He tries to undermine them, but they eventually sell him to someone on the Florida-Georgia line. And then we see Caldonia and Moses kind of develop a relationship. Moses believes Caldonia is going to free him, but he believes that his wife and child are kind of standing in the way of that. And at the same time, Skiffington is looking for Augustus, not looking too hard. He learns that his nephew, Counsel, and Travis were kind of working against him and weren't telling him everything up front. But again, Skiffington doesn't really punish Travis for selling Augustus into slavery because he realizes the law is kind of on Travis's side to do that. And then because Moses believes that his wife and daughter are getting in the way, he gets them to run off with another slave named Alice, which he thinks they'll just be caught and killed by the slave catchers. But they end up going missing, and no one can ever seem to find them. And at the same time, Moses is becoming more strict on the plantation. He forces Elias's wife to be to work through her pregnancy, and even after she gives birth. And so Elias has some anger towards him. We find that Augustus is sold into slavery on the Florida border, and he ends up getting killed when he tries to walk away, which is unfortunate. And then we see Moses also runs away, and people begin searching for him. And Skiffington, with his nephew Counsel, finds him at Mildred's place, who is like, no more slaves. No, this isn't going to happen anymore. And Skiffington tries to take her gun away and accidentally kills her in the process. And then they go look through the house. Counsel ends up finding some gold pieces and kills John as a result of that, so he can have access to those, and blames it on Moses, who was actually hiding in the house as well. Moses is maimed as a result. I don't think if he's straight up killed, he seems to live on, but Counsel and everyone aren't really held to account for killing John, or even Mildred. But it should be noted that Counsel never manages to find any more gold on Mildred's estate, on Mildred's property. But in the meantime, Manchester falls apart. This county that they're in just falls apart, and Robbins kind of loses out on quite a bit as a result. And then as the story comes to a close, we see that Moses' family and Alice are still alive in Washington, D.C. And so they manage to survive and thrive afterwards. But that's really where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, there is quite a bit worth talking about here. One thing I'll note in particular, I have a lot of, I'm white. That's what I want to say. I'm white. I have a lot of white privilege. And I'm not always the most, knowledgeable to talk about topics that are affecting the black community, especially something like black slavery, where former black individuals owned other black individuals. I might say something that doesn't sound kosher to people out there that call me out on it, but also it would probably be ideal to focus on black voices who talk about this. So probably seek those people out first before you watch this video, or watch the rest of this video at least. But I just want to get that out there, because one of the things that Jones is talking about here is the black slavery dynamic. Jones highlights a system where black individuals own other black individuals, which was, something that actually happened in the antebellum South. Sometimes, black individuals won their freedom, and then they just propagated the system that previously enslaved them. Why someone would do that? Well, there's a number of reasons. A lot of that has to do with prosperity. A lot of that just has to be with, this seems to be how the way things are done. Why would I question that? But essentially, free men are encouraged to do so. Like, if you want to put yourself in a better position, you might not be able to have a business in Virginia, like Henry's like shoe shine business or something like that, or boot making or tailoring business or anything like that. But you might be able to own slaves. There's nothing saying you can't do that. And so if you want to make money and do well and build up your name and provide a better life for your family, owning a slave seems to be the way to do that. There's a total social acceptance. This is what was going on in the South. There was a lot of people who disagreed with slavery, especially in the North, but in the South, it was just the way things were. That was the economy. And Robbins, pretty much says a lot of this to Henry. He says, it's your right to own slaves. But you have to be the owner. Like, you can't see these people as actual people. You have to see them as your property. And if you get on their level, then people are going to look down upon you, Henry. You're never going to achieve anything. Robbins is an absolute asshole, I do have to say. The way that he kind of manipulates Henry and forces him to basically be a traitor to his own race, among many other things. So, essentially what is happening here is that former slaves are propagating the system of oppression, and people might think that it's weird, especially slaves themselves, but there's not really a lot that can be done about it. Allow me to read you another interesting quote from this. Moses had thought that it was already a strange world that made him a slave to a white man, but God had indeed set it twirling and twisting every which way when he put black people to owning their own kind. Was God even up there attending to business anymore? Which is, a good question to ask. It's one thing for white individuals to own slaves because, they've already positioned themselves and they believe that they're better than people of color. But for a black individual to do that, that's just buying into the system of oppression. And it looks weird from the outside. But there's additional elements to that. Specifically, one of the characters, Fern, is talking to a pamphlet maker years after all of this, because the story kind of moves between time like that. And she notes one thing, like how if it were up to Caledonia's mother, like Henry wouldn't have married Caledonia. And when the pamphlet maker asks why, she doesn't really go into detail. And the narrator notes that Fern, wanted to keep some things from white individuals, like the way that some black bodies are more acceptable than others. And what she's referring to there is colorism. That in this specific instance, someone who's lighter skin might be more celebrated than someone who's darker skin, or someone with lighter skin might be propped up for more benefits or whatever, something like that. That's something that exists within black communities sometimes, whether it's promoting the racist system that already exists in the first place, or just creating something different and original all on its own. It is something that is there. So maybe the reason that slavery is allowed to exist beyond the propagating a system in place is that sense of colorism, and Jones is critiquing that as he's critiquing many things in this story, and I think he does a particularly good job at that. Another interesting element of the story is the concept of freedom and what exactly it means. Jones really shows the contradictions that exist in antebellum Virginia. Henry and his family only seem to be as free as the locals allow. They have their passes, the forms that say they're no longer slaves, which was very hard to get because Virginia only allowed a certain amount, according to the narrator in this story. But I do think that's based on some aspect of reality. Basically, the law saying this person is free and this person is not, which does seem kind of arbitrary and shows the contradictions as well as the artificial nature of slavery. How can one person be free but another has to be a slave? It seems like there's not really a lot of logic to that entire thing. But there's also like a tiered system where you have like the plantation whites at the top, the poor whites, the blacks who own slaves below that, and then the enslaved blacks even below that. So even though you're free, how much freedom are you really going to get? And that happens to Augustus in the story as he's sold off into slavery. Even though he has his papers, Travis is like, I'm going to eat those papers, which is weird. And then, he just sells them into slavery, and Augustus can't really prove otherwise. And the system is against him. Specifically, John Skippington notes that, he wants to punish Travis and get Augustus back. But in the eyes of Virginia law, there's not a lot of rights that Augustus had in the first place. So again, how free exactly is he? This is all it takes to really get him thrown back into slavery. There's other people who sort of believe that they're beyond the system, or that the injustices in the system won't be applied to them. In particular, the character of Odin, the Cherokee bounty hunter in this story, sees himself as making quite a bit of money off of the system of slavery. But as other characters note, once those poor whites, or even the wealthy whites, are through with black individuals and punishing them and whatnot, they might also turn on Odin. Like he thinks he's on the same level of them, but he's an indigenous man. He might have sold out, the black individuals, but and at the end of the day, he's kind of in the same boat as them, as he doesn't have the equal rights under Virginia law, under many of the southern states' laws at that time. So again, what exactly is freedom? And if you look at it another way, this is just kind of how things have to be. If you have a system of slavery, if you have a system where slavery is promoted and that's your entire economic system, this slave economy needs these type of injustices to exist, so that you can continue to sell people in slavery and you can propagate it, keep it going. Because the moment that you stop selling people into slavery, who's going to have to do those work? The plantation owners and the poor whites, and they're not really going to want to do that because there's not a lot of money to be made, or they're going to lose some money by having to do the work themselves. So there's a lot of questions of freedom that I think Jones poses in this story that I think reflect the nature of slavery, as well as what it means to be a free person in this system. Jones also utilizes religion in this story. You see that quite a bit with, there's the character of Moses. And Moses is named after, of course, the character in the Old Testament, the Torah, the Jewish book of, the book of Exodus. Moses was going to lead his people out of slavery, and this Moses doesn't seem to be doing that at all. If anything, he wants to be the guy in power now. Now that Henry is dead, he wants to marry Caledonia and kind of live the good life that he did not have as a slave. So you see some bit of religion used sort of contradictory there. Skippington uses the Bible a lot to refer to slavery and justify it in many ways. Even though he says that he is opposed to it, he's using the Bible to kind of justify it. Doesn't really, even though he sees a lot of injustices taking place, he doesn't really ever try to stop anything. He knows that Travis is doing bad things on his patrols, but he just lets it happen because Travis is, that he needs Travis to be effective at patrolling. You got to get those slaves back somehow. But there's a little bit of hypocrisy there where Skippington has the power to make effective change and produce a lot of benefits for people like Augustus and Henry, but chooses to allow the racism and the inequalities to kind of persist. And you see that with Robbins as well, because Robbins, he also uses the Bible to argue for slavery, but he's also having sex with the lady slaves, which is sexual assault, and having children with them and favoring those children, providing a better life for them. Often, neglecting his wife in the process. So if it were the case that the Bible condoned slavery and that this system was truly right, why are you having a relationship with those slaves? And why are you treating them fairly even if your Bible says you're not, that it's right to do what you're doing to them? And I think, that highlights the contradictions in slavery, as well as the sort of injustice that takes place there, because I don't think these people actually believe Like they want the system of slavery to continue, but I don't think they believe all the BS that they propose to believe about the Bible and the moral superiority of the whites opposed to the blacks or whatever. There's a use of all of that to kind of keep slavery in place, but these people aren't acting as though that's actually true. They're morally defective or many other things. And I'm not saying that, they should actually be harsher to slaves or anything like that, but I am pointing out the blatant hypocrisy that exists here and how it only shows that everything that exists here is artificial and created by humans to punish other humans. There are other interesting elements of this story. I do think there's a use of a history framing in this story where Edward Jones will kind of break down the story at points, like talking about the future and what else was going on at the time, kind of zooming out from the characters. And I do think that's interesting to kind of contextualize slavery and also show, how the past is affected by the more distant past and how the past, affects the future and might sort of be an influence on the general area and the communities that live on there even after slavery ends. Like, that's interesting, but it also sort of presents this story as like a historical narrative. Jones wants you to believe that this is real, but none of this is actually real. And that feels weird because there are a lot of other actually true, slave stories out there, actually true people who existed at the time whose stories, are more real. And therefore, like, if you're going to present something as a historical sense, like, why not tell those stories instead? I don't get why you have to kind of make something up and present that as real. It kind of like makes sense in the context of what Jones is trying to do, but at the same time, it does seem like he's trying to pass his story off as actual fact, when there is a little bit of fact here, but mostly he's making up everyone involved. And the last thing I'll note is this story does feel like it kind of meanders at times. It shifts to characters who are only given like brief attention and not really enough time to truly shine. And so it can be pretty boring from time to time, and a lot of the characters feel inconsequential. But again, I do think that's part of the sort of winding historical narrative nature of it, that even if a character does feel small, they might have a great impact later on down the road or something like that. But it does kind of drag the story down a tiny bit. Anyway, those are my thoughts on The Known World by Edward P. Jones. Pretty solid book, a great read for Black History Month, and even outside of Black History Month. It was really interesting finding something like this written pretty recently, whereas a lot of the stories about this kind of thing I could only find 50, 100 years or even longer in the past. So it was pretty good finding something more recent. If you have any thoughts on this, or you simply want to comment on something I said here, do so below. I would love to hear from you and have a conversation about such an interesting story. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this book or this author if they don't already know. I highly recommend that you seek it out. It's maybe not as good as some other sort of slave narratives or stories like that, but it does have a lot of fascinating things to say about colorism and inequalities and oppression from your own people and things like that. Also don't forget to join the Discord. There's a link to that in the description if you want to have further conversations about such things at that point. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and antebellum travels. Farewell.